Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. You know how sometimes something happens and it just seems like the worst thing ever. But then later you look back and you're like, huh,
Yeah.
actually that turned out to be the best thing that could have happened.
Yeah.
Well, that's what we're going to be looking at today. We're diving deep into the idea of a blessing in disguise. And we're going to be using this excerpt from A Blessing in Disguise, Meaning and Misunderstandings to help us out.
You know what I think is so interesting about this whole blessing in disguise thing? Is that it really gets at something that's like deep down inside all of us. This idea that we can find something good, even in the middle of something that seems totally bad at first. And it's not just that things work out okay in the end, it's that something good comes out of the bad in a way you never expected.
Right, like life throws you a curveball. And it turns out to be exactly what you needed, even though when it first happened, you probably wanted to throw it right back.
Exactly. The excerpt actually uses the example of losing your job, which I think we can all agree is a pretty terrible experience for most people.
Hmm.
But then it asks, what if? What if losing that job actually leads you to a career that you are truly passionate about? One that uses your skills and is something that you really value.
Okay, so you're saying it's not about everything being perfect right away. It's about being patient and keeping things in perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And the source we're looking at really emphasizes how these blessings, they often only become clear when you look back on things. It's kind of like when you're right in the middle of something hard, you just can't see how any good could come out of it. But then as time passes, you start to get a little distance from it. And then maybe you start to see how that experience actually ended up benefiting you in some way. It's like connecting the dots.
Like looking back and realizing, wow, if that hadn't happened, I would never be where I am today. But here's the thing. It feels like people say blessing in disguise all the time. And honestly, sometimes it feels kind of, I don't know, like it's just not the right thing to say.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The source actually talks about that too. It has a whole section on all the ways that people misunderstand this idiom. And one of the big ones is something they call premature optimism, which I think we've all been guilty of at some point. You know, someone's going through something really hard and we just want to make them feel better. So we're like, hey, maybe it's a blessing in disguise.
Oh, man. Yeah, I've totally done that. I mean, I meant well. But looking back, yeah, maybe not the best thing to say.
Well, the thing is, the excerpt talks about how even though you mean well, that kind of comment can actually make the person who's hurting feel even worse. Like you're telling them they should already be looking for the good, even though they're still in the middle of something really hard.
So what's a better way to respond when someone's going through a rough time? If we shouldn't jump to the blessing in disguise thing.
I think it's more about just being there for them. You know, just listening to them and letting them know you care instead of trying to put a positive spin on things. Sometimes just acknowledging their pain and letting them know you're there for them is way more helpful than trying to give them advice or tell them how they should be feeling.
Yeah, it's like hold off on the pep talk
Yeah.
and just listen.
Exactly. And this actually leads into another misunderstanding the source talks about, this idea that every bad thing that happens will eventually lead to something good. But that's just not always true. Some things are just hard, and that's okay.
Yeah, it's like not every cloud has a silver lining.
Right. And it's really important to remember that, especially when you're dealing with things like grief or trauma, because saying it's a blessing in disguise about those kinds of experiences can make it seem like you're not taking their pain seriously.
Right, like you're trying to force a happy ending onto a story that's not over yet.
Yeah, exactly. And there's one more really important point the source makes about all this. It's about personal responsibility. Because sometimes people use blessing in disguise as a way to avoid admitting they messed up.
Oh, yeah, I've totally seen that. It's like when someone doesn't study for a test and then fails, and then they try to say it's a learning opportunity, but they were the one who decided not to study in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. It's important to be honest with ourselves about the choices we make and how they affect what happens to us. A blessing in disguise shouldn't be an excuse to avoid taking responsibility for our actions.
So it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card.
Mm,
Got it.
yeah.
But if we're getting all these things wrong about blessing in disguise, how are we supposed to use it the right way?
Well, that's what we'll talk about next. But first, I'm curious. Have you ever had something happen to you that felt like a total setback at the time, but then later turned out to be a blessing in disguise?
Ooh, good question. Now that you mention it, I was just thinking about what you asked me.
Yeah.
And actually, I totally bombed an audition one time. It was for this play that I really, really wanted to be in.
Hmm.
And I just froze up on stage. I mean, it was mortifying.
Oh, wow. I can only imagine.
Oh, it was bad. But the crazy thing is, looking back now, That experience actually made me decide to take acting classes, which helped me get so much more confident. And I actually got a lot better at acting because of it. And guess what? Those classes are what eventually led me to this podcasting gig.
Oh, wow. That's a perfect example of what we're talking about. You took that awful audition and you turned it into something that helped you grow. And now you're doing something you really love.
I know, right? It's so weird how life works out that way sometimes. But you know, it's interesting. The excerpt we're looking at today, it actually gives us some really practical tips for how to use this whole blessing in disguise idea the right way. And the first thing it talks about is the importance of hindsight.
Right. It's like when we look back on things, that's when we can really see those moments where something that felt like a total setback actually ended up leading us to something better. It's not about trying to predict the future or anything. It's about looking at the past and seeing how everything connects.
So how can we actually do that? Like, what are some questions we can ask ourselves to try and figure out if something was actually a blessing in disguise?
Well, a good question to ask yourself is, what's something that happened to me that I thought was really bad at the time? But now that I look back on it, I can see how it actually benefited me in some way. You might be surprised at what you come up with when you start thinking about your experiences like that.
I like that. And actually, the excerpt even gives this really cool example. It talks about failing at a project, which obviously feels like a huge disappointment when it happens. But what if? What if that failure actually taught you some really important lessons or help you make new connections or even just change the way you approach things so that in the end, you actually end up being more successful?
Yeah, exactly. It's like even when you feel like you've totally messed up, there's still a chance that something good can come out of it. And sometimes that something good is even better than what you were originally hoping for.
Okay, so hindsight is super important. But what about timing? I mean, we talked before about how saying it's a blessing in disguise can sometimes make people feel worse, especially when they're still dealing with something really hard. So how do we know when it's okay to say that?
I think it really comes down to empathy and trying to understand where the other person is coming from. Because when someone's in the middle of a tough situation, what they really need is just someone to listen to them and be there for them, not someone trying to tell them how they should be feeling.
So basically, just be there for them. And don't try to sugarcoat things.
Right. The excerpt actually talks about this in the context of a breakup. Like, imagine telling someone who just got their heart broken, oh, well, it's probably a blessing in disguise.
Oof, yeah. I could see how that would not go over well. It's like you're telling them to just get over it and that something better is going to come along, which is not helpful at all.
Yeah, you're minimizing their pain and kind of putting pressure on them to move on before they're ready.
Okay, so we need to be mindful of both hindsight and timing. But here's something else I've been wondering. How do we actually know when it's truly appropriate to use the phrase blessing in disguise? Like, what are the signs that a negative event has actually led to something positive?
That's a really good question, and I think it gets to the core of what we're talking about here. Because it's not about just hoping for the best or trying to force a positive spin on every bad thing that happens. It's about recognizing a real change, a real positive outcome that came about because of something that seemed bad at first.
So it's not about wishful thinking. It's about acknowledging a real shift from bad to good.
Exactly, and that shift might not happen right away. It might take time.
But when you look back, you can see how that initial setback actually put you on a path that led to something good, something that you might not have gotten to otherwise.
Right.
That's a really important distinction. But I'm curious, why do you think this idea of blessings in disguise is so appealing to people? Like, what is it about this phrase that makes us want to keep coming back to it?
You know, I think it's because deep down, we all want to believe that things will get better, even when things are really tough. And this whole idea of blessings in disguise, it gives us a way to find meaning and purpose, even in the middle of really hard times.
It's like a little reminder
Yeah.
that even when we can't see the light at the end of the tunnel, there's still a chance that something good could come out of all this.
Yeah. It speaks to that part of us that wants to be resilient, that wants to bounce back from setbacks and find a way to move forward.
And it reminds us that sometimes those unexpected detours are actually the things that teach us the most. It's almost like a shift in perspective, isn't it? Instead of seeing challenges as just bad things, we start to see them as opportunities for growth and change.
I love that. It's like you're rewiring your brain to look for the good, even when things are hard.
Right. But, like we've been saying, it's important to be careful with this whole idea.
Definitely. It's not a magic solution for every problem, and it's definitely not a way to ignore real pain. or avoid taking responsibility for our actions.
It's a tool, but like any tool,
Yeah,
you have to know how to use it the right way.
exactly.
This has been such an interesting conversation. It's amazing how much there is to unpack with this idea of blessings in disguise. But before we wrap things up, I'm going to leave you with one last thought. Just take a minute and think back on your own life. Can you think of a time when something happened that felt like a total setback? Like you missed out on something, or a door closed in your face, or maybe you even like totally failed at something. It probably felt pretty awful at the time. But now that you look back on it, can you see how that experience actually ended up shaping you in a way that you're grateful for now?
That's a really great question to ask yourself. I think when we take the time to really look back on those moments, it can totally change how we see the challenges we're facing right now.
Yeah, it's like those moments when you suddenly realize, wait a minute, that thing that I thought was so terrible actually led to this other good thing. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
It really is. And I think those kinds of realizations can help us become more resilient so that the next time we face a challenge, we can approach it with a little more hope.
Like we're training our brains to look for the good, even when things are tough, which can be really empowering.
Totally. Because it reminds you that even though you can't always control what happens in life, you can control how you choose to react to it.
So as you go about your day, your week,
Mhm.
your life, I want you to keep this idea of blessings in disguise in mind. Don't just dismiss it as some cheesy saying. Use it as a way to reflect on your experiences. And remember that even when things feel really hard, there's always potential for growth and change. And maybe even something amazing that you never could have imagined.
And you never know. Some of your greatest blessings might be hidden in plain sight, just waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us as we explored the meaning and the misunderstandings of a blessing in disguise. We hope you learned some valuable things along the way.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep your eyes open for those hidden blessings. They're out there if you know where to